And so we covered, a fair amount of material, and then we had a lengthy break, and now we're back with the final versions of that. So, I mean, I think it is incumbent upon you to go back at least and look at chapters 17 and 18. Now, certainly, much of chapter 19, much of the material of chapter 19, we are kind of talking about and reviewing now. But, yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be the challenge. When we go way back, the beginning of our conversation was kind of the death of Harrison. So we elected Harrison to the presidency in 1840, and we said that Harrison was one of two people that were associated with the Whig Party that was elected to the presidency. Harrison was one. Just for fun, and it's not a part of this conversation at this point, but just for fun, who was the other? William Henry Harrison was elected as a Whig in 40. Only two people who associated with the Whig Party were elected to the presidency. I'll give you a hint, it was later. It was after 1840. Who was the other? Do you know? Do you remember? Ponder it for a second. After pondering it, do you remember? How about Zachary Taylor? Zachary Taylor in 48 was also a Whig. Those were the only two people that were elected that were associated with the Whig Party, right? Taylor and Harrison. And what's significant about Harrison is, yes, he's the first Whig elected, but he dies. And Tyler, not Taylor, Tyler takes over as the president, the first time someone had ascended from the vice presidency to the presidency. And Tyler is not going to behave in the way that Whigs expected him to behave. He doesn't support any of the kind of the Whig agenda. He doesn't support the American system. He doesn't support higher tariffs. He doesn't support a national bank, internal improvements, all of those things. How could he be a Whig and not support those things? Why was Tyler in the Whig Party in the first place? Irene? Yes, he opposed Jackson. So what unified the Whigs, at least initially, was everybody that didn't like Jackson for one reason or another. Tyler's faction of the Whig Party included Calhoun, and they were the anti-nullification people who believed deeply in kind of states' rights and were anti-tariff, but were associated with the Whigs. So Tyler takes over as president, and we know that eventually Tyler is virtually kicked out of the Whig Party because of his reluctance to support the Whig agenda. There is a discussion in your textbook about a number of incidents that involve the United States and England. And one of them is the Aroostook War. And that's something that you should probably take a peek at. It's all part of kind of Tyler's presidency and Tyler trying to shift focus from the traditional issues of conflict, which were tariffs, internal improvements, and the bank, to expansion. Right? And the expansionistic sentiment of the time was expressed with the term manifest destiny. What did that term mean, manifest destiny? What did that term mean? Go ahead, Coleman. Yeah, I think manifest destiny is the kind of ideology that America was destined to spread its institutions, its values, its governmental systems, its economy, its technology from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so manifest destiny becomes a justification for expansionism. And expansionism is going to get the United States into conflicts. Now, we didn't talk about all the conflicts that the United States gets into during the 1840s, and there are some conflicts with England, and one of those conflicts involves something called the Aroostook War. The areas that we did talk about in terms of expansion was the annexation of Texas and Oregon. Now, the whole story about San Antonio and the Alamo and Santa Ana and all of that is not on the test, right? So there's nothing about Santa Ana, the Alamo, Sam Houston, all of that fighting. The test picks up with Texas as an independent country seeking annexation into the Union as a state, right? So the test picks up with that. And the controversy over the annexation of Texas, right? That's what, you know, we'll be more largely talking about. What was the controversy? I mean, Texas is an independent country that had broken away from Mexico. Mexico doesn't recognize its independence. Texas wants to be admitted to the Union as a state, but on a number of occasions is rejected or spurned. Why? Why wouldn't we want to annex this large territory? Go ahead, Gabriel.
Isn't it because they were so large they'd throw the balance?
A balance over what?
Of like North and South.
Over what?
Slavery.
Slavery. So ultimately the annex of Texas really gets, you know, caught up with the issue of whether or not slavery should extend. And some people fear the annexation of Texas was just an effort to extend slavery, and it gets back into that notion of slave power. Now, in addition to the annexation of Texas as an issue for expansionism, so was the reoccupation of Oregon. Oregon is, why Oregon was a territory that the United States claims, but it really isn't controversial until the 1840s. I mean, the United States has a claim on the Oregon Territory prior to the 1840s, but in the 1840s it becomes controversial. Americans, many Americans, expansionists, are demanding that the United States occupy all of Oregon or fight the British, 54-40 or a fight. Why? What happened in the early 1840s that's going to justify America's claim to the entire territory? Go ahead, Nicole. Pardon me? I don't know that transpired. I guess what I was looking for is increased American settlement there. Remember we talked about the Oregon Trail? And that in 1843 a large number of people went there. Why did they go to Oregon? Why did they risk the Oregon Trail and all the dangers that were there? Go ahead, Irene. Yes, there was fertile land in the Willamette Valley, right? And they were attracted to that land, and they went there in large numbers. And as a result of a surging American population there and an expansionistic sentiment, expansionists are going to demand that the United States take the entire Oregon territory. Now, okay, the issue of expansion is going to play into the election of 44. Who was elected to the presidency in 44? We know it's Harrison in 40. We know Harrison dies and Tyler takes over. Tyler is really associated with no party, right? In 44, who are the presidential contestants? Does anyone besides the instructor remember? Go ahead, Jessica. Do you recall who was contending for the election in 44? Do you remember who the Whig candidate was? You do? No, it was not. No, it was not. Go ahead, Irene. Henry Clay. Do you remember who the Democrat was?
Wasn't it Polk?
Polk. Right? And Polk is, an unabashed expansionist, 54-40 or fight, all of Oregon, the annexation of Texas. He is, a disciple of Andrew Jackson. And remember, Van Buren was considered to be the front-running Democrat. And he and Clay, Clay was considered to be the front-running Whig, had kind of made a private agreement that they would keep the issue of slavery out of the election. I mean, I was thinking about that a little bit. This is a little bit off the subject, but it kind of goes back to the Stephen A. Douglas argument that we were making yesterday and today in class, that Douglas maintained the only way the Union can be saved is if slavery remains local. So if you think about 44, Clay and Van Buren, what they basically did in taking Texas off the table as an election issue was make slavery, keep slavery local. Because if Texas became an issue, then there would be a national issue in an election over annexing a territory that would expand slavery. And they feared that. But Van Buren doesn't get the nomination. Polk does. And Polk, is an expansionist to such a great degree that he kind of ignores the implications of the spread of slavery. And that's kind of really true. Polk can't figure it out. He can't figure out why everyone's so excited about this. Sure, we're going to annex Texas and there's slavery, so what? What's the big deal? It seemed like Van Buren and Clay had a better sense of how damaging that could be, right? So nevertheless, Polk is elected to the presidency, and we said that Polk has these determined goals. He wants to lower tariffs, he wants to divorce the Treasury from banking, he wants to settle the Oregon question. But we said he has one interesting goal that kind of stepped outside of everything that we were talking about. Do you remember what it was? And this really is what's going to set the stage for the Mexican War. Go ahead, Nicole. Yes, to acquire California. So, how did he want to get it? How did Polk want to get it? What was Polk's desired way of acquiring California? Go ahead, John. How did he want? Initially, Polk wants California. He wants to do what to get it? Yes, he wants to buy it. That's all. And the problem was that Mexico, who possessed California, doesn't even want to talk about selling it. So the result then is a war with Mexico that seems to really kind of give credence to the belief that America prompted war with Mexico in order to acquire California. Okay? So we talked about the war with Mexico, and there won't be any questions on the test about the actual conflict itself, any of the battles, the Battle of Buena Vista, or any of that fighting, nothing about that. But there will be questions about the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe. And so what is the big thing that comes out of it? What's the big thing that comes out of the treaty that ends the war with Mexico, that sets the stage really for the events that lead to the Civil War? Go ahead, Ryan. Of course you go ahead, Jackson Perry. What comes out of this treaty? What do we get? Yes, go. Right. Well, we already had Texas, but we get California, New Mexico, and Utah. And what do we give the Mexicans in exchange for acquiring that territory? Do you recall? $15 million. We give them $15 million in exchange for that territory. Now, the problem then is the question is raised, what will the territories become? Will the territories be open to slavery, or will slavery be limited there? What did David Wilmot want? David Wilmot, a New York congressman, right, a congressman from New York, on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, put forward the Wilmot Proviso. What did the Wilmot Proviso stipulate? The Wilmot, let me do this for you, Garrett. The Wilmot Proviso said this. It said that Wilmot and other Democrats would vote to fund the war with the proviso that, finish that, Garrett.
That slavery would be forbidden in any territory acquired by conflict.
That's right. Provided that slavery not be allowed to spread into the territory acquired as a result of the conflict. That the Mexican cession would be free of slavery. Now, was there any precedent to ban slavery in the territories like that previously? Nafadre, was there a precedent prior to that where Congress said, no, slavery is not permitted to spread into this territory? Was there precedent for that? You know what I mean by precedent? It happened before. When? The Missouri Compromise. Now, not on the test, but just for your essay that you're going to write. What year was the Missouri Compromise? Go ahead, Nicole. 1820. And what did the Missouri Compromise stipulate? This is not for this test, but your midterm. It stipulated what? That Maine would come in as a free state, Missouri would come in as a slave state, and slavery would be banned where? North of the 3630 line, right? North of the 3630 line, slavery would not be permitted to go into that territory, correct? So, what did Wilmot and the other Democrats want? The same deal for the Mexican cession. Slavery not permitted to spread there. Southerners are going to be furious at that prospect. That's going to make Northerners increasingly convinced that the reason for the Mexican War in the first place was to spread slavery. Again, the slave power conspiracy. No. Okay. It sets the stage for the 1848 election. Right? In the 1848 election, you have the Whig. Who was the Whig? We should know this. Yes. Who? Zachary Taylor. Who was the Democrat? Who was the Democrat? Go ahead, Fawn. Yes, Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was from Michigan, and Cass was associated with the notion of popular sovereignty. In the election of 48, which is in the same year as the Treaty of Guadalupe, right? The issue was the extension of slavery into the Mexican cession. The Wilmot Proviso had passed the House of Representatives several times, never passed the Senate. Cass and Stephen A. Douglas and other Democrats were advocating the notion of popular sovereignty. What did that notion suggest? How should slavery in the territories be addressed under the notion of popular sovereignty? Yes?
That the people in the land would choose whether they had slavery or not.
Yes. The people who actually went to the territories themselves would determine whether or not slavery should be allowable. Now, if you think about popular sovereignty, it goes back to that notion that I keep stressing, that Douglas and others argued that unless slavery remains a local issue, the Union will come apart. If slavery ever becomes a national issue, if it ever becomes a national issue and of national debate, then there will be irreconcilable differences between the North and South, and the Union will come apart. So the way to keep it local is to keep it local. Let the local people, and the advantage of that, besides, kind of keeping it off the national agenda, is it seems so democratic. Let the people decide. Right? If they want slavery, okay. If they don't want slavery, that's okay too. Right? So popular sovereignty seems to be the unifying alternative that the Democratic Party remains unified behind. Right? With Douglas and Cass and Buchanan and other Southern Democrats that support that notion. Now, the problem with popular sovereignty was its practicality. How do you do this? At what phase do you do this? Do you make this decision? So, all right. The election of 48, we said Cass won 15 slave states and 15 free states. No, I'm sorry. There were 15 slave states and 15 free states. Cass won 8 free and 7 slave, and Taylor won 8 slave and 7 free, but Taylor won the majority of the Electoral College, and so Taylor is elected to the presidency in 48. He's inaugurated in 49. The issue of the extension of slavery comes to a head early in his administration because of what? What brings the issue of the extension of slavery into the Mexican cession to a boiling point in 49, shortly after Taylor? Go ahead, Jesse. Yes, the discovery of gold in California. And the discovery of gold in California results in a large number of people going to California to live, and California needing government. And so Taylor proposed that California skip the territorial phase and seek admission to the Union as a state and determine the issue of slavery on their own. And when they do that, they choose to come into the Union as a free state. Now, the South goes crazy over that. Why? What was so problematic about California entering? If they wanted to do it, why was it? Go ahead, Corina.
Because
Absolutely, it tips the balance, right? And that balance seemed to be permanently going to be tipped. I mean, if the North has it his way and it bans slavery in New Mexico and in Utah, and California is free, and these free states come in, they'll elect more senators, they'll have more votes in the Electoral College, they'll elect a president, and then they'll appoint members to the Supreme Court that will totally overwhelm the South and threaten, the institution of slavery. Now consider this. Remember we talked about this today? When does the South secede? When Lincoln is elected without them. Remember I kept saying that? His name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states? So anti-slavery or anti-extension of slavery forces are able to elect a president with really virtually no southern votes. So where does this leave the South? Powerless. A powerless minority, right? And if the South can't count on the North to follow the Constitution, which would be their only protection, what incentive do they have to remain in the Union, right? Now, I don't know that kind of negates the idea that the issue here at hand was really slavery. I mean, really at the end of the day, the reason that they were so terrified about being a minority status is because they wanted to protect slavery, right? So I'm not sure that's true, but the politics of it is clear, and that's why they so tenaciously fight California's entrance into the Union as a free state. Now, California entering the Union as a free state is just one issue. Another issue that comes to a head in 1850 is the issue of runaway slaves. Who is Harriet Tubman? Who is Harriet Tubman? Go ahead, Fawn. Yes, we would associate, it's a picture of her in your book, we would associate Harriet Tubman with the Underground Railroad. How is the Underground Railroad relevant to this conversation? Yeah, go ahead.
It provided slaves like refuge, and it allowed them to escape to the north.
Yes. So the Underground Railroad was a system of a system of safe houses that allowed slaves to escape the South. So what was so problematic about that? Yes.
The North were people in there were helping slaves.
Yes. So people in the North were assisting slaves in escaping, and then when they yes, go ahead.
And they were following the Fugitive Slave Act, which was in the Constitution.
Yes. And beyond just simply doing this, Northerners seem to be trying to circumvent a constitutional obligation, which was the Fugitive Slave Clause. When you read that South Carolina secession thing, remember my fantasy, right? I'm fantasizing about you. I'm going to go to my house and think to myself, I wonder if those kids are reading that thing. Yeah, I wonder if they're doing that. And I know one thing, Gable, you'll be reading it. I don't know about these other schmoes, but you'll be reading it. You're darn right. So yes, that Fugitive Slave Act is a big deal. So that's an issue here as well. Runaway slaves. Now, eventually, all of these issues are wrapped up into the Compromise of 1850. Right? The Compromise of 1850 tries to take all the outstanding issues. The status of slavery in Utah and New Mexico, the status of slavery in California, the issue of runaway slaves, debts owed by Texas, the border of Texas and New Mexico, slavery in the District of Columbia, the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Henry Clay rolls all these issues into the Compromise of 1850 that we dramatically, discuss in our class in January of 1850. And then there is this titanic debate about whether or not this compromise should be, approved. And we talked about Clay, obviously, that orchestrated the compromise, that supported it. Daniel Webster, who was Webster? Who was Webster? What state? What? Massachusetts, a Northerner who supports the Compromise of 1850 in the 7th of March speech. How about Calhoun? Did Calhoun support the compromise? No. Calhoun rejects the compromise because there's not enough protection for the South as a minority section of the country. Calhoun says no, there's not enough to protect us. And Calhoun, is seen as a sectionalist. He's seen as somebody that's divisive. But at the end of the day, what Calhoun is kind of arguing is the only way the South is going to stay is if they can protect their interests. Basically saying if they can protect, in my opinion, basically saying if they can protect slavery. Right? So when it becomes clear that they don't think they can protect slavery, what do? They leave. Right? So Calhoun is desperately trying to kind of come up with ways where the South can feel comfortable enough to protect their interests. Right? And so when they can't, so he's kind of right. He's kind of right that look, this isn't going to be enough. He's right about that. I don't know if he's right about whether the South should have stayed for slavery, but he's right about knowing the section of the country that they wouldn't stay if they didn't feel they were protected. Well, okay. What about Seward? What was Seward's contribution to this debate over the Compromise of 1850? William Seward. What state was he from? Go ahead, Fawn. He was from New York. And what's he associated with? He's associated with a notion that it articulates that really infuriates Southerners, that might have justified John Brown's raid, in fact. What does he associate? Do you remember? Anybody? The higher law. Seward said there is a higher law than the Constitution, the higher law of God, which infuriated Southerners and alienates Seward from the South in such a way that in 1860, when Seward was the leading presidential contender of the Republican Party, the Republicans are going to reject him because they think he is too antagonistic towards the South. Right? So Seward is against the compromise. Calhoun is against the compromise. Clay and Webster are for the compromise. The compromise fails, right, when it's voted on as a package. What things lead to eventually, what kind of bizarre thing kind of leads to the compromise eventually passing? You wouldn't suspect this, yes?
Being voted on in separate parts.
It's voted on separately. But even those separate portions are passed. Who guides the compromise through Congress eventually? Who is really the person the parliamentarian, yes? Douglas, right? And he is aided by Millard Fillmore. Who was Millard Fillmore? Yes. Say it again. No. Millard Fillmore, yes. He was the vice president. He eventually became the president. Why? Taylor died. Taylor opposed the compromise, dies in July of 1850. And when Fillmore takes over, along with Douglas, they twist enough arms to get the component parts of the compromise passed. So the compromise of 1850 passes, and Zachary Taylor's death contributes to the compromise of 1850. Now, under the compromise of 1850, that eventually passes, what would be the status of slavery in Utah and New Mexico? What would be the status of slavery in Utah and New Mexico? Does anybody know besides the instructor? I know, but I'm not going to say. Gongoloff, I'm not going to say. You must. Go ahead, Gary. Popular sovereignty. Right? What was the most, to Northerners, what was the most antagonistic part of the Compromise of 1850? What was the most troubling part of it? Go ahead, Emily. The Fugitive Slave Act. A strict new Fugitive Slave Act. Now, that strict new Fugitive Slave Act was in response to personal liberty laws. What were personal liberty laws? There's a question about this on the test. What were personal liberty laws? Does anybody besides myself and De Palma remember? Go ahead, De Palma. Son of a gun. Go ahead, Irene. This is the review session of your life. Go ahead.
They were given to
Yeah, that's not bad. It were laws that gave rights to escaped slaves, right? The South did not want escaped slaves to have any kind of rights. You're accused of being an escaped slave. You come with me. I'll present proof. You don't get a defense. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get anything. You have no rights, right? The North passed laws that attempted to give people who were accused of being escaped slave legitimate rights. The South deeply resented it. They deeply resented the personal liberty laws, and basically, the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed as a part of the Compromise of 1850 negated all of the North's personal liberty laws. So now remember, the South wants to secede because of states' rights. So when the North asserts their states' rights to give escaped slaves some rights, right, on the local, their state right to do that, the South advocates a federal law to negate that. So states' rights are okay, right? Or I should put it this way, a big government is okay if it's protecting slavery. But if it's not, we want states' rights. Right? You know, we have the principle of states' rights. It's not really about slavery, it's about states' rights. So I mean, there is a hypocrisy in that. So Diksha, when you're making your case for slavery against states' rights, you might want to point out the hypocrisy of the South in terms of supporting not just a strong national fugitive slave code, but also a national territorial slave code later. They want a slave code that would protect slavery in the territories to negate what? Popular sovereignty, the assertion of local rights. So it seems interesting that the South is committed to the assertion of local rights unless it intrudes with slavery. Right? Yeah, but, all right. I'm surrendering my bias, Diksha, that I think that the issue with slavery are not states' rights. But anyway. Okay, what caused the Whig Party to come apart after 1852? A simple answer. What caused the Whig Party to come apart? Yes. The compromise, and in that compromise, slavery. Right? The Whigs could not in the Whig Party, there was too strong of an anti-slavery sentiment to even adhere to the compromise of 1850. (1852) was the last time that there was a Whig candidate for president. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster both died in that year. There's something called the OSTEND Manifesto, Austin Manifesto. Check that out in your book. That's relevant to this. Now, the Compromise of 1850 that eventually does pass, right, is illusionary. No one really compromises. But many people in the country cling to it. Pierce is elected because of his support of it. Others in the country support it. Many say, Stephen A. Douglas says, he'll never talk about any of these issues again. The issues are resolved. Everyone just shut up and things will be fine. But it is Douglas that negates the Compromise of 1850 with proposing what piece of legislation? What breaks the whole thing? Good, Em. KansasNebraska Act. What does the KansasNebraska Act do that is so infuriating to Northerners? What does the KansasNebraska Act do that is so infuriating to Northerners? Yes?
Didn't it force Kansas to be a slave state?
That's part of it. But in a larger sense, it negates a previous legislation. Yes?
The Missouri Compromise is no longer...
Yes, it negates the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise said no slavery north of the 3630 line. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, would it be possible to have slavery north of the 3630 line? Yes, under the basis of popular sovereignty. Dividing the territory in two was a suggestion that part of it would be slave and part of it would be free. Now, as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party is going to begin to germinate. So the Republican Party is going to elect, in 1853 there's no Republican Party. In 1854, Kansas-Nebraska prompts people to gather together in anti-Nebraska kind of gatherings. Those anti-Nebraska gatherings are going to birth a party, a Republican Party that is committed to stopping the spread of slavery. Now again, why are these Republicans? I mean, the Republicans that gather together and form this party are not necessarily people that have overt affection for African Americans or African American rights or anything like that. but they are adamantly opposed to the extension of slavery, right? And are willing to form a party that's on that basis. So why are they so against the extension of slavery? And on kind of a non-moral basis. What basis do many in the Republican? I mean, there are some in the Republican Party that have a moral opposition to slavery. But how does it go beyond moral opposition? Yes.
Like, they support wage labor.
Say it again?
They support wage labor.
Yes. We call that the free labor ideology, right? The free labor ideology. That anywhere that slave labor goes, free labor cannot, right? Free labor cannot compete with slave labor. Slavery denigrates labor. It denigrates work. It certainly does. I mean, it's true. If you enslave somebody and force them to work, then the worker is denigrated. And the slaveholder is lifted up, right? I mean, this is kind of an interesting thing, you know. And in the North, the ideology of opportunity, expansion, you know, the veneration of work is a part of the thing that Lincoln bought into. And as long as slavery spread somewhere, free labor could not compete with it. And Northerners basically wanted the West to be an outlet of opportunity for Northerners, not an extension of a system that would degrade labor. And this was fundamentally important enough to form a political party in order to prevent the extension of slavery. Now, beyond that, there is also this fear of a slave power conspiracy, that the aristocracy that controlled slavery controlled the national government and were intent on spreading slavery everywhere. We saw this in the House Divided speech. Right? In the House Divided speech, Lincoln says, either we're going to have it all one or all the other, which is suggesting that, look, slavery is going to spread everywhere if we don't stop it. All right. So, okay. Now, Kansas, Nebraska, the Republican Party. Let's see here. I'm just going to skip over that for a second. The Dred Scott, I think there's one more. We want to go from there to Bleeding Kansas. But your textbook talks about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the influence of that book before they get into Bleeding Kansas. Right? So, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, incidentally? Harriet Beecher Stowe. And why was it so influential? Why was it so influential? Yes?
It showed people in North the horrors of slavery.
Yes, it shows people in the North the kind of immorality, the horrors of slavery. Southerners respond to this very negatively. And we also said that Uncle Tom's Cabin has international implications. How so? Garrett, how does Uncle Tom's Cabin have international, or Nafarji, you have a thought? Go ahead. How does it have international implications? What do you think he said? I mean, De Palma, could you hear the man?
Yeah.
Yeah, what did he say?
He said like how
Yes, that's correct. Yes, you know, the people in Britain and France read the book. And so when Britain and France were in a position of deciding whether to intervene on behalf of slavery, right, this is going to make them reluctant to do that. You know, but there were other people that wrote books, and one of them was a guy named Hinton Helper. Take a peek at his. Yes, go ahead, Irene. Where are you going?
What's his name?
What did she say? Hinton Helper, like helper, like little helper, like that's right, like Santa's helper. But his name is Hinton Helper, right? And so, okay, now let's talk about Bleeding Kansas. What do we mean by Bleeding Kansas? When we say Bleeding Kansas, what do we mean by that? Go ahead, Gabrielle.
It was like people there rushed there to make it slave.
Yes. Who was the Emigrant Aid Society? Jackson Perry. What was the Emigrant Aid Society? How do they contribute to Bleeding Kansas? Yes. It was an organization in the North that wanted to finance free soil settlers to go to Kansas, so that when the opportunity came to vote for to determine whether slavery would be there, they would vote against it. right? So the Immigrant Aid Society is something that Southerners are going to resent, right? Now, Southerners respond to that by taking actions that Northerners see as further evidence of a slave power conspiracy, where they try to pack the ballot boxes and force slavery down the throats of people. What was John Brown's role in Bleeding Kansas? What is he associated with? The massacre where? Do you remember, Nicole? Powonatani Creek. Right? The massacre at Powonatani Creek. What was the Lecompton Compromise? De Palma, you had asked me about this, so now that you had asked me about it, you can articulate that to the rest of the class. What was the Lecompton Constitution? Go ahead.
Basically, like, people were forcing Kansas to become a slave state, but a lot of people in Kansas did not want to become.
Yes. And the Lecompton Constitution was a constitution that was offered to Kansas that would have allowed slavery there, and Kansas would accept that constitution in return for entering the Union. In other words, the Lecompton Constitution said, Kansas, if you want to enter the Union as a state, you've got to accept slavery. And the Lecompton Constitution, is something that, again, further alienates Northerners and convinces Northerners of a slave power conspiracy. Who was Preston Brooks? Who was Preston Brooks? He is famous, Preston Brooks. Why? Who is he? Preston Brooks. Go ahead, Armin. He caned Sumner. Remember, we caned Sumner? It was Preston Brooks. What was Sumner speaking about? Yes.
His drooling?
Well, he was talking about Butler's drooling, but in a larger sense, he was, what was the name, do you remember the name of his speech? The Crime Against Kansas, right? Apparently, when John Brown heard that Preston Brooks had caned Sumner, he went crazy. That's what prompted him to attack at Powonatani Creek. Now, who won the presidency in '56 and why? Who won the presidency in '56? We're getting close here. Who won the presidency in '56 and why? Go ahead, Flan. Buchanan, what party? He was a Democrat. And probably part of the reason that Buchanan won is that he had distanced himself from other Democrats who had been associated with Kansas. And people feared that if he didn't win, the Union would come apart, because Southerners threatened to secede if a Republican was elected in '56, right? Now, a Republican wasn't elected in '56. Buchanan was, and Buchanan was a Democrat that was not associated with everything happening with Kansas, as was Douglas and Pierce. So, who was the Republican candidate, incidentally, in '56? Anybody remember? Yeah, go ahead. Fremont, yes. And what party did Fillmore represent in '56? Not the Free Soil.
Liberty?
No, not the Liberty, yes. The American Party. And Corina, what was the American Party committed to? Not the Mexican, yes. But no. Yes, go ahead.
Nativism.
Nativism, right? And what prompted a nativist response? What immigration from what place? Catholic Irish immigrants were terrified. Now, the Dred Scott case is going to be announced days after. What is the big implication of the Dred Scott decision? As a result of Dred Scott, what had to be true of the territories? Go ahead, Deeksha. As a result of the Dred Scott decision, what had to be true of the territories? Yeah, that's true. But I mean, specifically in terms of the territories. Yes, go ahead.
Was it that the Constitution stated that it was basically pro-slavery?
Well, yeah, the Dred Scott decision said that any new territory, any territory, had to be open to slavery, right? So that meant that Congress could not pass a law closing it. So the Missouri Compromise that had done that had been unconstitutional. And any future law that would do that would be unconstitutional. And popular sovereignty would be unconstitutional. However, the Dred Scott decision was circumvented with what notion did Stephen A. Douglas promote that circumvented the Dred Scott? What was it called? Do you remember? We talked about it. Yes, good. The Freeport Doctrine. That said that you didn't have to ban slavery to keep it from going to the territory. You just simply wouldn't support it. Right? Now, certainly, one of the biggest things that alienates the North and the South is John Brown's reign. What was so inflammatory about John Brown's reign? Yes.
Well, for Southerners, it scared them because their slaves could attack them.
Yes, that Northerners were encouraging a slavery rule. After John Brown's reign, the South didn't trust any Northerner. Can't trust them. They're abolitionist emissaries. They're emissaries of abolition that are going to come into the South and prompt a slave rebellion that's going to threaten the safety and security. How can we remain in the Union if this is going to be true? Particularly if we don't have some way of protecting our institution of slavery from people who would do it harm on a governmental level. Now, we talked about the presidential election of 1860, Lincoln, Bell, Douglas, and Breckinridge today. And there'll be a question on the test about that. And that's pretty much it. Anybody have any other questions? We did a pretty thorough job of addressing most of the things on the test. Peek at those things that I mentioned to you. And what we're all going to do tonight is read the South Carolina explanation of secession.